I think absolutely.
So let me tell you about an example from my work, and I'll just give you kind of 4 sentences which look at the different layers of anger, hurt, need, and fear. So I felt angry when my colleague rejected my report. The hurt behind that was because I'd put in a lot of work into that report, and I felt my colleague had just rejected it out of hand. What I needed was my colleague's support in order to present it to the rest of the group. But I also needed recognition from him about the amount of work I'd put in. So that's the layer of need. And underneath that, and often the key driver in conflict situations, is about fears. So my fear was I was going to be left to deliver the report on my own. And my kind of even deeper fear is I'm not very good at my job. I'm getting this all wrong. So as mediators, we want to get behind the anger to these core needs and fears that are driving the conflict. And when we're thinking about needs are practical, but they're also emotional. So that's the difference between the support in presenting a project and my need for recognition. And our fears are rational and often irrational. And those are the most dangerous ones, those kind of irrational fears that we have.
What would an example of an irrational fear be, Carey?
Well, I would say in the example I just gave you, even supposing my report wasn't very good, it would be to think I'm rubbish at my job, I'm going to lose my job because this one report isn't very good.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Thank you.
Fantastic. Something that I find, and maybe others will be nodding at me too, is when I'm angry, it's really hard to hear the other person. When they're speaking to me and they might be angry as well, really what I'm listening for is I'm listening for a space in what they're saying so that I can intervene, so that I can pounce on them and jump in. I'm also listening for any errors in the arguments that they're making. So I can say, you know, I didn't say that, or that isn't what happened. You're not telling it right. And I'm also looking for opportunities to criticize, or in the UK we say to put someone down. So maybe to say you never help, or you're always complaining. So the temptation when I'm angry, when someone else is angry, is actually to try and speak louder. And that means that we're listening less. And if I had a tip for myself as well for others, it would be when I feel like I'm not being listened to, I expect it's because I'm not listening to the other person. Often I identify that need in myself.
And does that come when you hear yourself speaking louder?
Not enough. But I'm working on it. I'm working on it.
It's always a process.
So what is mediation? I'm imagining quite a few people are very familiar with mediation, so bear with me. So this is how some people would view mediation, as kind of stopping things coming to blows. But more and more, most of us, I think, would see mediation as a bridge. And if we look at the next slide, that's more how we would see it. So it's a process where we help people who are in conflict talk to each other, come together, and find a way to resolve their conflict. A couple of key things is the mediator, it's not their role to tell people what to do or what they should decide. It's their role to help people make decisions for themselves. And it's also the mediator's role to be non-judgmental and stay out of the process. So I love that image for mediation, which is kind of about rebuilding or building that bridge between people.
I do like that too, Carey, because the previous slide with withholding the punching bags, I mean, that's certainly something that you would want to do at the beginning of a conflict, but ultimately you would like these two individuals to be able to work together themselves without you there, and as you said, to rebuild the relationship.
Yes,
because I think oftentimes we have more conflict. Well, actually, correct me if I'm wrong. Do we have more conflict with people we know or people we don't know?
I think that's an individual thing. I think some people feel safe to have conflict with people they know, so they have all their rows at home, and other people will maybe have their arguments at work, and other people find it easier to have arguments with people they don't know, so they'll be the ones arguing with the bus driver or in a store when they want to take something back, creating a big scene. So they feel safer to behave like that in public. So it really varies for different people.
Interesting.
I think, yes. So here's the owl, just to remind you, three things to think about. The owl as having the overview, the big picture of the situation, the owl with the good hearing and the good eyesight, and the bottom one is the owl that's waiting to pounce, that is able to hone in on the details. And these are the skills that we're going to use as we go through mediation. And I'm just going to talk to you about three steps in the process and illustrate that a little bit more. So our key role, helping people to listen to each other so they can resolve the conflict. So we're listening in a slightly different way than maybe others have experience of. But in the process, initially we meet with people on their own to understand about the conflict from their perspective. Sometimes they don't want to take it the process any further, and I would say then we've done a role which I'm calling witnessing, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But if people are happy and choose to, we'll bring them together for what we call a joint meeting, and then our role as mediators is to translate between them so that they can understand each other and then help them move forward. So I'm going to talk about those four areas in a little bit more detail. Why do we get into conflict? So I said one of the areas of work that I'm involved with is working with conflicts between neighbours, and certainly here in London we live very close to people. They can be like about 2 bricks width away, above, below, beside us. It's a very crowded city. And a lot of the work we do is around problems about noise. So if you ask people about what their idea of music is, for some it would be a orchestra on the left, and for others it would be the rock band on the right. But it's these differences in what we enjoy and what we like that can often lead to conflict. And I'm going to use the rock band on the right to talk about a model that we find that's really core to our work as a mediator. So if we look here, this is called the PIN diagram, or positions, interests and needs. And this model is showing us that often in a conflict situation we take up a position and the other person will take up an opposing position, and we'll try and argue back and forth, push me, pull you, yes, no. We're unlikely to find a resolution unless we can get behind the positions to think about people's interests and think about people's needs. And if you can do that through listening and asking questions, you can often find that area of common ground. You'll see at the bottom in the middle of the 2 triangles, and that's the place that we can build agreements from. So let me give you an example just to explain the difference between positions, interests and needs. If we think about the rock band that we saw in the other photo, somebody's position might be, I want to play my rock music in my home in the evenings. A position often is like the solution to something. It generally sounds like it's got a full stop on the end of the sentence and there's no discussion to be had. Behind that position, though, will be some interest. So the interest might be this person has a very stressful job and they need to come home in the evening and they need to unwind before they go back to work again the next morning. It might be their space for just relaxing. And the need underneath that is that need to relax, but also the need they have to decide how they live in their own home. So most of us like to be in charge of the way we live in our home environment. And whereas it may be hard to appreciate the enjoyment of listening to rock music, we'll probably all feel differently about that. I think most of us could sign up to the need to relax and the need to be in control of our home environment. And that's where people can come together to start finding a way to move forward. So here we have our owl who's doing the big picture listening, and two things we need to be doing when we're meeting with parties individually. So we need to get from them the overall picture, how they see the situation, and we also need to start sifting or sieving for what are the key issues, what are the most important things, and what are the key emotions they're experiencing. So we're kind of laying out the map and listening for what's really important. And generally we can tell that through the tone of voice, the emphasis people put on things, or by watching their body language, or often they might repeat something a number of times to make sure that we've heard.
Carey, can you talk a little bit more about those non-verbal behaviors that you just identified in terms of emotions?
Yes, so interestingly, I think some people are able to articulate their emotions. So they'll be saying, I'm really angry, and they might be doing some hand, you can't quite see me here in London, hand banging on the table. You'll see the kind of impact of the anger. And for other people, they will be describing something, and it will be more in that tone of voice that they're using. And what we will do is, if it's not clear, and I'll talk about this a little bit further on, is it's important to kind of check out what our reading is of the situation. So we might say, I noticed that your foot is, is waggling a lot. Are you uncomfortable? Are you, because that's often where anger comes out. It's an emotion that needs an outlet, verbally or physically.
I see. Thank you.
So still thinking about working with the parties individually, a couple of things that we're working on is, I've called it separating fact and fiction. Most of us, when we're describing a conflict situation we're in, we think everything we say is factual and true. But generally, what we're saying consists of facts, and then our interpretations of situations, maybe our values, maybe our beliefs. It's all muddled up, and part of our role is to try and separate out, this is what happened, this is what you thought it meant, this is how you felt about it. Because the second thing we need to do is separate out the facts and the feelings for people. The facts are what, the problems are what we people can resolve. The feelings are what drive the situation and need to be recognized, and people need to be clear around that.
That is very hard to get clear around, isn't it, Carey?
Well, I think one of the benefits of involving mediators, if it's a difficult situation that you can't resolve for yourself, is that's something we can be doing for people. So our role is really to hold the space for them so that they can participate in the conflict and participate in its resolution. But also we are listening to help them make sense of it. It's like having an extra pair of ears, or 4 ears if we've got 2 mediators. Extra 4 ears. A couple of other things that we would be looking out for when we're working with the parties individually is thinking about what are the gaps or the contradictions in their story. So someone might describe working with a colleague and only be talking about what happened in the last year, and we might want to go back to, what was it like when you first started to work with that colleague? Did you have a good relationship, or has it always been bad? Similarly, people often contradict each other because in the heat of explaining, they might not realize they're saying one thing happened on this day and something else happened on the same day. So we'll need to be checking that out and looking for that gap in what they're saying. And to echo things I've been talking about, we're also looking for that mismatch between the words people use, their tone, and their body language. So if somebody goes like, I'm really, really angry about that, I'd be questioning, it doesn't sound like that to me that you're so angry. Perhaps they are, perhaps they're not. But it's important to get to the bottom of that.
So as a mediator, and this is something that we could use in our interpersonal conflict as well. Without a mediator, we would identify the difference between what we hear non-verbally and what we hear them saying.
Yeah. And sometimes I think it's almost, I'll talk about it hopefully a little bit more when I talk about listening to ourselves as mediators, but it's sort of that hunch you have, or that instinct, like this doesn't quite fit together, this doesn't quite make sense. And often that's one of the sort of keys to starting unlock things. There's a mismatch between this. Mm-hmm. So definitely look out for that. So this looks like a terribly weighty picture that we've used here, but we were looking for something to illustrate one of the things I think mediation offers people is a space to talk about a conflict where they're not going to be contradicted, they're going to be given the time that they need, and their experience is going to be valued, both them and themselves. And I think what that does is it enables people to stop needing to defend their position and putting all their energy into backing up what they've been saying and how they see it. And if they don't need to be doing that, then it frees them up to think about, how can I move forward? What can I do differently? So I've used the phrase listening to witness, really. It's saying, maybe I can't solve the problem for you, but I can certainly hear it and respect that you've had that experience. Other people who might be involved in resolving conflict may need to challenge or take action in terms of what someone says. So it means we're in a different role from any other agency that might be involved. And often as mediators, I think we get thanked for listening to people because that's the experience they have. They feel valued and they feel their experience is being valued.
Now, Carey, when you listen to witness, I keep going back to that idea that you said sometimes you meet with them individually and then other times you meet with them jointly. When you listen to witness, would that be an individual meeting or a joint meeting, or both?
I think it happens in the individual meetings, and it might be that somebody at the end of the individual meeting says, you know what, I don't need to meet with them, I'll go and talk to them myself. Or they'll say, I don't want to meet with them, I'm going to resolve it in a different way. And that might be the end of our interaction with them. Or we do it and then they decide they do want to meet, but they've still had that experience kind of to underpin them moving forward to the next stage of the process.
Yeah, and I actually love this image because I know for me, when I really feel heard, that's exactly what it feels like.
Like someone just lifting that weight off your shoulders. Yes.
Absolutely. Somebody
it is a gift.
gets me.
It is a gift, I think. So where people choose to meet, so we bring them together, and we do have a structure, which I'm not going to talk about now, but it follows very clear steps, a mediation process. But what we're wanting to do now is enable parties to listen to each other. And as I've said earlier on, it can be really, really hard to listen to someone you're in conflict with if you're very angry, if you're very upset about things that they've said or done. So I called this stage of it the listening to translate, and probably the key skill that we use is the skill of summarizing. So we listen to people and then we summarize back to them what we've heard them say. And what is key about that, one of the things that helps in mediation is if you can't listen to the person you're in conflict with, often you can listen to the mediator summarizing back to them and hear what the mediator's saying rather than the person you're in conflict with. So it's like the other person gets two chances to hear how somebody's feeling from the speaker and the mediator. What's really key when we're summarizing is something here I've called attributing or attribution. It's really important, because our role is to be neutral and not get involved in the conflict, that we always say, so you've told us that you're feeling angry, or you said that your manager's been treating you unfairly. And that's different from just saying, and your manager treated you unfairly, because that might sound like I believe that or I'm agreeing with it. So attributing the feedback is really important, and also checking it out with them. So this is my understanding of what you said, and you've been really angry about it. Have I got that right? Have I missed something? Have I got the main points? And my experience is people are very generous. If I have got it not quite right, they're more than happy to say, and then we can make sure we've got the key points there.
Carey, can I interject for just a moment?
Of course.
I have a question from Jenny concerning listening to witness. And what Jenny is asking is, when you listen to witness, does the other party also listen? If so, is there ever that aha moment for the other party by you listening and them hearing?
So, in fact, listening to witness is a phrase that I've come up with to try and describe what I think happens in that moment when you offer someone really good listening, and where you're not necessarily going to do anything else with that experience. So I've used it to describe what happens when we're listening to someone we've met with them individually. I think, though, when we have a joint meeting, so when we have two parties in a conflict in the same room, each gets a chance to speak, and then the mediators summarize what they've said, that point you can often see in the other party the aha moment, or the I never realized that was what it looked like, what it sounded like, I didn't mean it. So if people can hear each other, I think there is the space for understanding. That's the challenge, to get the hearing across. I hope that answers that question for Jenny. Jenny can come back if that's not clear.
Jenny says yes, thanks.
Fantastic, fantastic. So I want to talk about the other thing we do in this stage of mediation, and we call it reframing. And the aim of this is about trying to make it easier to hear what the other person is saying and remove the sting from the statement. So there's two things we do. One I've called omitting, and the other I've called rewording. So an example of omitting might be, let's say somebody said, she's an idiot, she shouldn't have done that, I can't believe it. If I was reframing that and summarizing it back, I would just say, so you're saying she shouldn't have done that. I would drop the she's an idiot bit, because that isn't going to help people move forward, and that's just going to wind the situation up. In a situation where we might do some more rewording, so let's say somebody said something like, you know, that's the craziest idea I've ever heard. Again, that's likely to be a bit inflammatory for the person who said it. So we might say to the speaker something like, so you're struggling to understand how that idea might help move us forward, or something like that. We're always trying to keep the underlying meaning, but phrase it in a way that makes it easier for the other person to hear.
Carey, it's me again.
Yes.
And this is just wonderful. Alan just asked that he says that he's often found that allowing the individual to speak and be seriously listened to, that they find the solution to the problem all by themselves. Yes. Alan would like to know if you found the same thing during your practice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In that phase I call listening to witness, I think because they don't need to spend their energy defending their position, all that kind of headspace is free to think, oh, how can I sort this out? How can I use it? And that's the best outcome for us as mediators, because the intention is for people to resolve it from themselves. And if they don't need us to go any further, that's fantastic.
And Carey, Laura here. So one of the things that I recognize in the listening to witness, or for myself in interpersonal conflict, is oftentimes I need to hear myself say something to recognize if I really feel that way or believe it or not. And sometimes I'll say what I thought I was feeling or thinking, and once it comes out of my mouth and I actually hear it through my ears, I recognize it's not how I'm feeling or not how I'm thinking.
Yes.
So I think that the listening to witness would play that role as well.
Yes, absolutely. So certainly I've been in the position of feeding, summarizing back to people, and they're going, I didn't say that. And I'd be like, you did, but clearly that's not what you want to be saying.
Right.
And because when we're in conflict, you know, our thoughts are jumbled up, our emotions are jumbled up. We're not speaking as clearly as we normally would.
Right, absolutely.
So the intention in mediation is to help people move forward and find a resolution. And here we have the owl coming in, who's getting to be really specific now and looking at the details. And this, what we're doing as mediators is really holding a space within which people can have this disagreement. So you could think of it like a boxing ring, and we've got a set of rules in there, but we're holding it so that people can sort everything out. And we're keeping hold of the overall picture, but now we're starting to think about what are the issues these people need to resolve. So we'll be drawing up an agenda and clarifying with people, okay, you need to sort out how you're going to share this, or who's going to do which piece of work. And nearly always there's a communication element in there. You're going to want to talk about how you talk to each other in the future. So we keep hold of the big picture, but we're looking for the specifics. Another aspect of our work at this stage, I've called it connecting or painting the picture. But whereas people maybe started in their two positions and they don't see that their conflict's connected, we might be saying, so you're saying that you think the way work distributed is unfair, and you're saying that you think your colleague doesn't do as much work as you. But actually, this is the same problem. It's like you're looking at it from the different perspectives. So we're painting that picture, trying to bring them together. And also we're looking for any positives, anything we can build on, no matter how small. So we've got here our acorn, which is, we coined this phrase yesterday with Laura, is we want it to grow into the oak tree of agreement. But even that oak tree will start with a small acorn. And so we're looking for things that people might say, for example, are, oh, I hadn't realized that it had that impact on you, or if I could go back, I wouldn't do that again, or I wished I'd done something differently. Those are all the little positive things that we can use to start moving forward.
Carey, can I ask you, when you say look for the positives, do you also comment on them as a mediator as well? Or in interpersonal conflict, should we comment on those?
I think it's really important to recognize them. So am I right that you said if you could go back in time, you wouldn't have done it that way? Is that what you're thinking? And recognize that. And then you can often say to the other person, so your colleague's saying if they could go back in time, they wished they hadn't done it like that. Do you want to respond to that? Because it's really someone saying, kind of, I made a mess of this, but I didn't mean to, or I wasn't thinking. But so we are picking them up in that way and kind of testing them out with the other person. Mm-hmm. And if there's anything, so if somebody says, I might be able to think about doing something differently, we'll be saying, is that an offer about how we can move it forward? So we're looking for those so we can use them. Sometimes you might just make a bit of a note of them and then come back to them when the timing is right. But they're little gifts for building the future with.
So those are the little acorns to build the future with,
yes,
as you would say, to build that tree of agreement. I love that.
And the other thing that we have, which we use in different, people would refer to this in different ways, but I call this the magic wand question. So it's often hard for people stuck in conflict to think about how they want it to be. They know how they don't want it to be because it hasn't been working. But we would say, you know, if you could wave your magic wand, what would you do? What would it look like? What would change? What would you like? And that frees people up just to think a little bit more creatively about possible ways forward. And out of that might come something that they will find useful for resolving the situation. So that's the magic wand question.
And Carey, did I hear you correctly that you try to steer them away about what not to do and focus more on what to do? How would it look differently?
Yes.
And what would people be doing?
Yes, there is a sort of turning point, might be too, I mean, it's often something you can see when you look back at a mediation, but there is a point when you need to say, we've looked at the past, we know what didn't work, and now the purpose of mediation is for you to think about, how do you want it to be? How do you want to go forward from here? What needs to change so you can work comfortably together? What needs to change so you can live next door to each other? Whatever it might be. And then sometimes it can be a challenge to keep people moving forward because they want to be wallowing a bit in the past because that's what they know, and that's almost more comfortable than the future, which is unknown. So to be creative about thinking about the future can be helpful and can be a bit of lighten the mood a little bit for people.
Terrific.
So the other area I just wanted to talk about is about, I've called this listening to myself. So I think when I was thinking about the different ways of listening in mediation and what we're doing, I realized the role of a mediator is to be non-judgmental, to be impartial. My personal view on that is something I have to practice actively all the time because my brain is running all the time with comments, opinions, thoughts. You know, I can't believe they said that. You know, why don't they do this? So how we can use that as mediators, one of them, so if I'm sort of feeling very anxious or something and I can't really make sense of it, I might say to people, is anybody feeling anxious? Or I'm feeling a little bit anxious. Is that going on for someone? Because it might be I'm picking it up from someone else, or it's kind of I'm reading it through my own emotions. So that's a tool that we can use. Another one is supposing it's really easy to come up with solutions to other people's problems. It's much harder to resolve your own, but you might be thinking, why don't they just do this? You know, this would sort it out. And what you can do, because it is not our role to make suggestions, it's a really key thing we don't do, is to sort of turn that thought or idea into a question. You know, I'm just wondering if you thought about how you could divide this or how you could share it, rather than giving the solution. And the third thing around is whether or not I can put the thoughts aside, like park those thoughts. So clock that I'm having them, notice that I'm finding somebody a little bit annoying, and just put it aside. And sometimes as mediators we work in pairs, and we've got the kind of luxury at the end of debriefing, and we can talk that through and think about where all those ideas were coming from. So these are what I would call the kind of conscious listening to myself. But the other area I talked about at the start that I'm really interested in is what is the impact of our unconscious listening. And there's a lot of evidence now to back up the idea of unconscious bias, we call it in the UK, and I think in the States you more usually refer to it as implicit bias. But basically it's a lot of evidence to say we like people like ourselves. And as mediators, we need to be mindful how this will play out, because it plays out in very subtle ways that we may not be aware of. But it's like, if I like someone, if I like one of the parties a bit more than the other, it might be that I listen just a little bit more to what they're saying, or I might give them a little bit more attention. So my body language is turned towards them a little bit more. It might be that I give a little bit more weight to what they're saying. I give a bit more importance to what they're saying. And similarly, if I less like someone, they're going to be getting less of my attention. So that's something that I need to be thinking about and consciously checking. And it's a hard one to do, but it's good to have it on the agenda, I think.
And Carey, I think you know exactly the question I'm going to ask. How do we make an unconscious bias conscious? How do we do that?
Yeah. Well, that is a really interesting question, isn't it? Because once it's conscious, isn't it? So maybe it's not unconscious. I think what it is for me, it's around trying to tune into what I'm saying. And if I'm thinking, oh, that person's a little bit irritating or something like that, it's likely I'm going to be doing less of. And if I'm feeling like, oh, she's really nice, I'm likely to be listening, giving more attention and more positive regard. So I think it's sort of tuning in around that level. It's also practical things like just the way that you set up the seating so that you are sort of sitting in between people and equally, and monitoring, am I giving kind of equal time to people and equal eye contact and that sort of thing. One of the ways it often plays out is, in my observation, is that we'll use the name of one party. So we'll say, so Laura, you told us about this, and she said that. So we don't use the name of the second person. So that's a kind of really little one to be careful of.
Terrific. And Carey, I think this question may be a little bit challenging because we're coming towards the end, and
Okay.
I so appreciate all of the information that you've been able to give us. You framed it more so in mediation, which is of course where you come from, but now thinking about transferring these skills to interpersonal conflict.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say would be some of the top tips that you have for us when we're actually in the conflict and we don't have a mediator there with us?
The absolutely top tip, I think, would be if you could act as the mediator in your own conflict. And that would be if you could listen to the person you got a conflict with and then summarize what they've said so that you're clear what they've said before you speak. So you kind of bring in that whole interrupter phase, and then you can speak and you can ask the other person if they can summarize what you've said so that people get to hear. So that's a really important technique. The second thing I'd really suggest, and I find it hard, is to speak in the I. And what I mean by that is saying, I'm feeling angry, I'm upset, this would be my request from you, rather than what many of us like to do, which is to speak in what I call you language, which is blaming language. You're always getting it wrong. It's your fault. You shouldn't have done that. Because that is just language that's likely to inflame the other person.
That's for sure. Great
So
tip.
it's kind of about, because I think anger is a very infectious emotion, it's to put a break in there, which you can do by using that technique of summarizing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Carey, I have another question and an observation that I think are good to ask you at this time.
Fantastic.
The first one, it has to do with, what happens, how do you handle it after a while, a short while, the same conflict returns?
Yes.
Have you experienced that?
Yes. Well, one of the reasons we meet with parties separately, aside from wanting to get the whole picture from them and see, is to see if it's mediatable. And part of that is to see whether people really want to resolve it or not. And I call it, I don't know how this translates over to the States, but we have a lot of soap operas on the television here. So I think people want to watch them, and they like being in the drama of being in a conflict, say, with their neighbor. And so sometimes we will visit them, and my sense is I'm not sure they really want to sort it out because they are completely hooked into being in this situation and all the stuff that's going on and how bad it is and how wrong I am. So we will be saying to people, you know, do you want to sort it out? You know, are you prepared to sit in the room and listen to somebody else? And the timing's not always right. I think something that's great about mediation is people can come back to us in 3 months or 6 months, maybe, when they've got tired of things, or when the timings, or when it feels like the right time. So that's an option. And I think when I first started mediating, I was very zealous and I was trying to mediate everything, and I feel quite embarrassed about it now because it was a bore for my family and friends, for sure. But I'm more aware now that some people don't want to sort it out. They're not in that place to do it, so they don't. It's a voluntary process.
Okay, and this actually feeds into another observation that Michael Gilbert's had, and I've also experienced this his observation as well. And what Michael observes is that in education, the unconscious bias is reflected in teacher grading. Several studies have shown significant differences in grades between students who are more like their teachers. I know as an educator, that's something that I try to avoid. And Laura, I'm sure that you've run into that as well.
Yeah, I think I'm more familiar with how unconscious bias plays out in the workplace, but certainly I've done some reading that says that the first time you mark a student's papers, you will give them a grade, and then most people will tend to judge subsequent papers from them in the light of whatever the first grade was. So if you gave them an A grade for the first assignment, when you read the next one, you're going to be looking at it through A grade lenses, even if it's a U grade essay or assignment. So I think this is such a new area that's developing, and it's so interesting. And I think for me, the fact it's unconscious and happens because of the way our brains are designed, it frees us up to talk about it without possibly the guilt that conscious bias has for many of us. So I think it's great we can be having the conversations, and it isn't our intention to be biased, but most of us will be.
Yeah, Phil, one of the, we use Blackboard here at Rockhurst University, and one of the great things about having students take like short answer or essay test in Blackboard is that you have the option of grading without names, which is just a really wonderful thing to do, because then you have absolutely no idea who said it and you really are focused on the content. But I'm always dying to know who said it too.
Fantastic. So I was kind of reaching a place shall I do a little summary, and then would that be useful?
That would be very useful, I think.
So I just wanted to come back to remind you of the owl. And something I like about the owl metaphor is every time I use it, it just makes me stop and think. And it's a little reminder, because it's like, listen like an owl. Does that make sense? But actually, it reminds me to get in listening mode. And the things about owls is they have their great hearing and their great eyesight. They can map out the territory. They can see the big picture, but they can home in on specifics. And also, they're very, very patient, and they're very wise. And I'm not saying all mediators are wise, but we're working on it. But you can use these skills to help other people understand what's at the heart of their conflict, and then to enable them to listen to each other and help them move forward to a resolution.
Terrific. Carey, thank you so much. Let's turn to the audience, see if there are any questions for Carey at this point in time. Just a reminder, we will be taking a 5-minute break, and then Carey's graciously offered to come back, and we will have open mic for approximately 50 minutes, so we can actually talk about what we've learned today and share our experiences with it. But before we, go ahead, Carey.
Well, I was just going to say, I imagine some people were listening and thinking, I did that. I already do that, some of that, but I'm hoping people have got some different ideas they can take away, and maybe they'd be happy to share those, or they might have some ideas about how to improve some of the things I've been talking about. So it'd be great to hear that as well from people.
So can we, is there anything in chat, Phil?
I'm sorry, Laura, say again.
Is there anything in the chat area at this
There is
point?
nothing. There is nothing in the queue right now.
Okay, let's give people a second. If you would like to ask a question right now to Carey, now would be a good time.
Just let me know and I will unmute you.
Carey, what this might mean is people really want to interact with you without going through this chat feature.
And that would be great. That would be great. Don't let me get away with no questions. That's what I'd say.
Yes, you're not going to get away with no questions, that's for sure. Just let me remind everyone that this was brought to you by the International Listening Association, and we definitely invite you to become a member. As I had said earlier, our annual convention and conference is going to be in Omaha, Nebraska next month. So we invite you to come there. Wonderful to be able to be around other people who are as passionate about listening as we all are, and there are a lot of great member benefits. One of the member benefits that's actually also a non-member benefit are these webinars, which we do quarterly now. And the best way to hear about these is if you're a member, you're going to be getting the emails advertising them, but also you can look at our social media as well. Phil, before we take a break, do we have any questions in chat?
The only observation in chat we have here about the slides, if they're going to be available, and then Helen has said some of the skills that Carey has described are similar to the counseling skills, people solving their own issues.
Mm-hmm. I think I absolutely agree that, I mean, a lot of us lose listening skills in different capacities. I guess as a mediator, we're using it to help people resolve practical problems, whereas, say, a counselor will be using quite similar skills, but to dig kind of deep into someone, you know, and their individual motivations and why they're doing things.
Carey, you just said something that sparked a question in me. You said as a mediator, you help people solve practical problems. Does that mean that mediators recognize kind of the difference between practical and emotional and won't venture in on problems that are purely emotional?
Generally, I think in the cases that I've been referred, there is a practical problem that needs sorting out, and it's got a lot of emotion around it. I'm trying to think, I can't think of an example. So sometimes what I might do is, if I meet someone and I think they're so caught up in their own stuff, for want of a better expression, I might work with, I would call it, I'm coaching them. I do some coaching with them before I would involve them in mediation, because they need to deal with everything that's going on with themselves before they can deal with the conflict with somebody else. But that's still based around their ability to maybe be in the workplace or be a neighbor. It's not the sort of work a counsellor would do. I would generally be doing deeper work, but there will be a very narrow line. I think there's something called solution focused counseling, which I think is fairly close to mediation.
Mm-hmm. Terrific.
Some people might know better than me.
Okay. Now, just a reminder, we will be sending out these slides, today's PowerPoint, to the email address that you registered on, so you should get those today. Nan will be sending those out. Let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. I have 02, 2 minutes after my hour, which is 10 o'clock. I know you all have different hours. Let's come back at 10:07, or excuse me, 07 after the hour, and then we will probably perhaps unmute people at that point, Phil, and everyone can have a discussion.
Okay, that's great, because we're starting to light up now.
Terrific, but now you have to wait for 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to pause the recording now.
Questions or comments or ideas? What do you have?
Yeah, I'm going to laugh.
I have a question whenever you're ready.
We're ready, Carol.
Well, it's not, actually it's more of an observation. Carey, I'd like to say how grateful I am to you, first of all, because you are so articulate and your commentary flowed so beautifully. It was a joy to listen to you. That's number one.
That's lovely. Thank you very much.
And I'd like you to know that you fascinate me in the sense that I have come from a mediation background, and the term mediation has always explicitly been used as between two people or more, two parties joint. This concept of listening to witness, for me, it sounds as if you have two separate practices. You have a listening practice, and you have a mediation practice, and your listening practice sounds like a marvel of model for everything that I believe listening should be for another human being. So it's really wonderful to note those distinctions that you've made, because listening is at the foundation for all this work.
I think so. I think how that came about was through talking to people about doing this webinar and thinking about how we use listening and what the impact is. And I realized that so often that just by doing this listening, it does free people up. So, I wanted to give it a name. So we wouldn't ever specifically say to people that's what we're doing, but it's my experience that by offering them that safe space to talk about it and not challenging them, not forcing them to defend it, it's so liberating for people. But I think also maybe Laura said that was same for her. I think the same is for me, if I can talk to a friend and get it all out there,
exactly.
A, weight off the shoulders, and B, well, now I can think about what to do about it. What would be interesting, I think, you see, in this country, we'd have to think of a new name for it, because I don't think people would come to something. If we said we'd like to listen as a witness, they wouldn't come, but we could think of something else we could call it, really.
Can I interject for just a moment, please? Everybody, if you are not, you'll have the ability to mute and unmute, but if you're not asking a question, could you please mute your microphone? Right now, we're hearing typing going on, and there are some other conversations. If you would like to ask a question, you could keep your microphone unmuted.
So I have a question, may I?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, it's Anita. Hello. Thank you so much for the presentation. I like the imagery. I always love the presentations that do not consist just of the verbal, just the words that we read. So thank you for doing that. And the metaphor is really great. I knew nothing about owls. Now I do know something about them. So that's great. And my question is this, and I am a mediator as well. One of the issues that we address in mediation is the notion of safety. We talk about creating a safe place for people to come and to have a conversation that, of course, is going to be difficult for them. So I'm wondering if you're in your practice, what steps do you take to address your mind to a potential of violence or threats, something like that, but both in the past, so whether you do it in pre-mediation brief. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. We can
Okay,
hear
sorry,
you.
because you disappeared. I saw a black screen. Anyway, so whether you do it in the pre-mediation setting, or how do you handle any threats or what appears to be for yourself as witnessing listener, an act of violence during the mediation. So how would you, or how do you, or how have you handled something like that? Because it has happened to me in my practice, and it took me completely by surprise, and I felt quite helpless. So,
Yes.
of course, I ended the mediation, but it's something that I think we should all really have on our minds. And there is a lot of violence in the world, and I'm in Canada. So,
Okay.
we don't carry guns like my American colleagues, but still we have a lot of violence. So,
And what area were you mediating? What were you mediating about? Was it family, or was
Yes.
it family? Okay. So firstly, I need to say I don't do family mediation. That's the area I don't do. With, I guess we're more likely to get violent behavior in neighbor mediations. And that would be, we have a model that we mainly use where we bring everybody to the same building. We meet them separately first for an hour each, and then we meet them together. So we call it an all-in-one model. And our cases are screened by the workers, and if they thought any reason, anything in the notes we got that said that model is not a good idea, they then arranged for us to go and visit them in their own homes. So if there was any trigger on the notes to say safety's an issue, we'd go and meet them in their own homes. And we always work in pairs. So we have two of us, which is one of the things for safety that I think is important. And if we were concerned about it, we'd be thinking about those things about where do you position yourself in the room so that you can get at the advice, I think, is so that you can get out first. I think that's the case. Yeah. My experience of bringing people together is they have rarely, their bark has rarely, have I got that the right way around? Their bite's never been as bad as their bark. So my experience is when I meet them privately, they talk tough, put them in the room with the other person, and they're not the same, because it's much harder really to sustain that anger. So I haven't had your experience, and that must have been scary. The other thought I would have is if you had, part of our training, we're looking for any signal, whether it is like the foot tapping or the little vein. Some people have a little vein up here. There's lots of things, or a bit of steam coming out the nose. If there's any signs, but it sounds like you didn't have any signs of that. But the other thought I would have would be to put people in different rooms and do more of a shuttle mediation. But where I think we need to feel safe in order to do our role. So I'm always really clear with mediators: if you don't feel safe, get out, because you can't mediate if you're frightened of people.
Carey, I heard you say that you mediated in pairs. Is that a country norm, or is that just a personal practice norm?
It's a stream of mediation norm. So in this country, most community or neighborhood mediators mediate in pairs, and that's because generally we're doing it on a voluntary basis. I think it's actually the best model, but quite a bit of my work I'm paid, and I do that on my own because people wouldn't be able to, they wouldn't pay for two mediators.
For two mediators.
But yeah, that's mainly the way community mediation has evolved in this country.
Anita, did that? Oh, I'm sorry, Carey, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, what is great about it is you have two people, you've got the four ears I talked about earlier, but you've got a colleague to bounce things off, and it helps kind of minimize taking sides or any favoritism, because there's two of you there. So it's great, and it's a great learning tool, so to work with different mediators.
Yeah. Anita, did that answer your question?
Yes, I think it's a topic that we could spend a lot of time on and share our experiences from different fields to have a conversation about that. I have one follow-up question, and it's quick. Carey, are you coming to the convention in Omaha?
I'm not. Oh no, I'm sorry. It's a long way from. I would love to, and I am a new member of the International Listening Association, but I won't be there this year. Maybe next year.
Well, we will
but I
miss
would
you.
love to be. I'll be thinking of you.
Who's got another question or comment for Carey?
This is Jean-François.
Jean-François?
Carey, thank you
Hello.
very much. Thank you very much for your clear explanation about the role of mediator. I've learned a lot about this aspect. And I would go back to before the mediator action. How can we use listening to prevent conflict or prevent disagreement or different point of views to degenerate or to turn into conflict? You have experiences about that.
So is it like, how can you intervene as early as possible? Is that behind your question?
No, it's maybe before, maybe to prevent conflict would be to teach or form people to have a sort of better listening practice, or be more effective listeners. But maybe
Yes.
it's just off your topic. It's just before calling the mediator.
Yes, yeah. I would love it if we were all trained in listening skills and we all took the time to use them. I think it's a challenge in everybody I know is rushing. They're in a hurry. They don't have time to listen. I would say, though, that if you don't have the time to, you pay for it further down the line, because it takes longer to resolve a conflict than to nip it in the bud. I think sometimes you can guess conflicts are going to happen. So a conflict I'm quite often asked to mediate is where two people go for the same job and one of them gets it and the other doesn't. And I would say that's a conflict waiting to happen. And what's most useful if people could sit down and talk about it, but people tend to avoid conflict and not talk about it. So where you can see things like that are likely to produce problems, trying to encourage people to have the conversation can be useful, and to talk about it before it takes off. It could be, though, that other people who are listening have got some other ideas. So maybe we could ask Laura other people.
Other people's
They've
ideas
got any thoughts
on that question?
It's sort of the preventative side of conflict, listening to conflict in conflict.
Yeah.
I have a thought that kind of leads into a question about that. This is Sheila Bentley, and hi, Jean-François. It seems like oftentimes a lot of the things that you're ending up mediating have to do with power and who's in charge. And so I'm wondering if that's some of what happens, before the mediation comes about, that it's really a conflict about power. And I'd also like to just kind of broaden that question a little bit. If you were engaged in a conflict and you wanted to try to do some mediation, how do you maybe approach that with the other people that you're involved in, so they don't see that as that you're trying to grab the power? Because it seems to me that the mediator might be seen as someone who, is maybe not necessarily in control, but is guiding or has some power that the others don't. And if you've already got an issue with power, how do you address that?
And have you got any thoughts about how you would do that, Sheila? Or
no, I don't. I really. Other than making a statement up front that, I'd like for us to be able to solve this problem, and I'm wondering if we could use some steps. But, then it's kind of like the psychologist whose family says, don't put me, I'm not one of your clients, or that sort of thing. So anyway, just, it seems like.
Yeah, I think that's a great start, is like, I'd like to talk this through. I'd like to, to put that on the table. I'd like to see if we can resolve it. I guess if you're worried about people thinking you've got the powers to say, has anybody got any ideas about how we could talk about it, or when we could do it, or how we could structure it, and, try and engage them in doing that. It's also, I would say, that light touch. So got a thought, maybe we could all talk for 5 minutes about the problem and see where it gets us. But I don't suppose you do this, Sheila, but it's trying not to lay down the law, this is what we're going to do, and encourage them in. I think the whole area of power is another webinar and a half, isn't it? Because it's so fascinating. There is kind of what you could call like societal power, isn't there? And then there's institutional power. But there's so many, very early on in my career as a mediator, I mediated between a young white man and a very elderly black woman. And I fell for the stereotype that the young white man would be strong and articulate and the elderly black woman wouldn't, and overcompensated towards the elderly black woman and didn't give the young white man a voice. But the power of articulation, actually the black woman was incredibly articulate and powerful. And, we'd made lots of assumptions and got them all wrong, really. So we had to kind of recalibrate. So I think information is power, articulacy is power, gender is power. There's lots of different things. I think IT is power, and Phil has the IT power here. That's what I've been learning. It's that kind of language is power that you can use to help people or use over people. So my thought about power is to be mindful of it, but it's not as obvious as I've experienced in my experience.
I also think that actually goes back to when you were talking about where you mediate. You were talking about how you whose turf it's on, that sometimes you have to go to a person's home, but whomever's bailiwick, so to speak, that you're on may sense that they have a little edge up.
So normally, Phil, that's great you raised that, because I think we would visit people in their own home, but we try and bring them together on neutral territory for exactly that reason. Because if we were in one person's home and not the other, they'd think they're righter than the other person. But also, we want to take people away from where the problem happens, so they're not kind of re-triggered by being in that environment, and try and put them somewhere new. And ideally it would be in a nice room where people can think nice thoughts, and often it's more likely in a community center or something like that. It's not as glamorous as I would like at this stage.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, Carey, I would think that also the topic that Sheila raises has a great deal to do with the persona of the mediator, the nonverbals, the manner, perhaps even the way the mediator dresses to create this atmosphere of not being, I mean, you're in charge, but you're not in charge. And in the mediations that we did, I was trained out at Columbia University, we did that upfront piece, Sheila. We kind of had a little piece that encouraged them to understand that although we were the conduit or the liaison, we were there to help. We were there to encourage, to get participation, as opposed to be in control, and even use the word control, so that it's not the elephant in the room anymore.
It's so interesting because mediators have no power, but people want to give it to us, don't they? Or they assume it, because that is the norm when you get someone in to help solve a problem, that they have some power over you. And often people will say, what would you do? And, we have to get trained, don't we, to deflect that question, put it back on them to resolve that. But I think the things I think mediators in England have had huge discussions over is, what do you wear? And also whether or not you accept a cup of tea when you go around to visit people, because people have very different views about these details of our work.
What are the answers to those, Carey?
Well, I'm a big tea drinker, so I'm always like, I can bend the rules for that. I think it's about, whether you accept hospitality from one side and not the other, and if that gets discovered, and what does it look like. So possibly a purist might say don't take anything from anybody, but I'm a pragmatist at heart, so I might do that.
Casey, if I may, two questions. One has to do with balance of power, especially in a labor employment area. It's important that a mediator balance the power, especially of somebody that might be a superior to somebody who is a lower level employee. How do you do that? And then my second issue, or second question really, is, at least in this country, I find that most people who enter into mediation, in the back of their mind, actually wants arbitration. They want somebody to make the decisions for them, because mediation requires them to do the work, where arbitration says, here's my story, you decide. How does that work in your country?
Sadly, pretty similarly. So I've been involved in mediation for a long time, and what is great is when I started 25 years ago, people didn't even know the word mediation, and they couldn't hear the word. So once I got a cab and I gave him the card for the mediation center I was going to, and he said, "You must be very relaxed." And I was like, "What?" But he was reading meditation for mediation. It's like people couldn't understand the word. Now lots and lots of people know the word. Lots and lots of people have trained as mediators. But the shift I haven't seen, that I feel really sad about, is that there are not enough people wanting mediation. I think for the reasons that you're saying, is people find it hard to take responsibility for the problems and for the solutions, and so they would rather chance it and have someone else decide for them. And I'm not sure yet that I've got a solution for that. I feel after all this time I've been mediating, I'm more convinced it's a really positive and powerful way to resolve things. And I haven't got the groundswell behind me as yet. So if anybody's got any thoughts about that, that would be great. I think your other question about the balance of power, particularly in the workplace, is a really interesting one. And I'd say probably I find a manager, staff member, those are very hard ones to mediate often, because because there is that difference in role and someone is managing someone else. But what I would do is talk to people about the manager, about how they see their role as a manager, what type of manager there are, and also talk to the staff member about what type of management they want, to see if there's some way through like that. Because often people have very different ideas about what a manager is. In this country, it's a role that people get when they're good at something else. So you're a good teacher, and then you get to be a manager of a department. You're good at customer service, and then you get promoted. I think it's a role that is hugely important and not necessarily recognized so well. And I think but I've also experienced the employee feeling more powerful in the mediation than the manager, because the manager feels as if they've done something wrong, because if they were a good manager, they wouldn't be in mediation. So I think they're tricky and need quite a lot of careful thought.
Thank you.
I don't know if does that help you?
It does.
It's not a solution, though, is it?
No, there is no solution other than trying to balance the two, and I usually try to do that in caucus, in separate rooms, to get each one's idea of what they expect of the other before I bring them together. Once I bring them together, I will then speak to both of them in terms of roles, of what each other one wanted, which seems to balance out their power just a little bit more than they could do themselves.
Yes. Okay, that's great. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That was terrific. Who else has something they'd like to share or a question they'd like to ask Carey? Oops, Carol, you're still muted. I see your mouth talking.
I'm unmuted now. Hey, Carey. As I said before, I thought all of your points on how to listen to the people you're working with represent for me ideal listening models. This is what I've spent most of my life trying to offer to the clientele that has come through my door or the student. I'm interested to know how you came by all of these insights. What is your, did you have formal training in listening per se? Just anything you can offer that would explain how remarkable it is that you have come to these conclusions. It is not a common set of beliefs or understanding in my experience.
Well, Carey, you're very generous, so thank you for those comments. I think I was really lucky. I had actually been living in Australia, and I came back to live in England in the early 90s when mediation was just taking off. It was very new, but the minute I found out about it, I knew this was what I wanted to do. I'd been looking and looking. So I got to go from being trained as a mediator to being a trainer very quickly, in a way that would never happen nowadays. There was no accreditation for trainers or for mediators. It was people making it up based on a model we'd stolen from the United States or borrowed or whatever. So I had to kind of learn how to be a mediator and learn how to be a trainer on the spot. And I guess I've been doing that a long time. I'm endlessly fascinated by it, and I find a lot of my colleagues are also friends. So I do spend a lot of time talking about mediation or thinking about mediation, or because it's so interesting. So I think it's a magpie. I'm the one who collects things. Like if I hear a good idea, I will have been writing it down so that I can store it and use it and bring it back at a later date. So that'd be my tip for people, is nick it. If somebody's got something good, steal it.
That's what we do at the ILA. Yeah. We have been nicking it for years now.
Yes, but that's how it is. You know, you'll see a colleague do something, you think, wow, that's good. I like that. I'm going to try that. So to keep building that picture. But all the work I do is really about communication and helping people communicate. So I guess I'm thinking about it a lot, really, trying to make sense of it. And I'm fascinated with sometimes how easy it is to communicate with someone else and sometimes how impossible it is.
Welcome to our world.
Yeah, isn't it?
And sometimes often simultaneously,
yes,
right?
Yes. It's like, how did this happen? How did this happen?
Yeah. Joan, you look like you might have a question, but you are muted. Am I reading your nonverbal correctly? Joan Byrne? There you
Joanne.
go. Joanne, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, here we go. No, I was just actually typing in, saying, Carey, what a great presentation.
Thank you.
Fantastic presentation, and thank you. And I hope I'm not on the big screen.
You are. You are. Just to let you know, you are.
I didn't know I was going to be on the big screen. So it's been fantastic, and I just love the way you thought through the whole area of listening, which has been around for, in academic circles, and you made it your own. So that was really fantastic. So
thank you.
Illustrations of the animals and the way you thought through how to make the headings, that really came from your own experience, connected to the academic and all the other work as well. So thank you.
Thank you. That's kind.
It's given me room for thinking,
yes,
which is always
good,
important. I play and continue to think around
yes.
It.
So Joanne and I have mediated together a couple of times now, haven't we? And so we can take that forward next time we do a case. We mediate around special educational needs together, which is, I didn't talk about that very much today because it's complicated and I didn't really have time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Somebody else out there?
I have a question, Laura.
Mm-hmm. Ellen,
Carey,
thank you.
Thank you so much. Carey, thank you so much for that presentation. I thought it was stunningly good. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And I'm not sure whether anybody mentioned earlier, but in the ILA, we have members in 19 countries. And I'm just interested in whether you have any comments about any cross-cultural differences in your mediation work.
I've mainly worked here in the UK, and I think there's a few areas that are a little bit different. So it might be, for example, in a culture where, say, for example, the man speaks and the woman doesn't. It's a challenge for us as mediators because our model is for everybody to speak. And so we have a lot of debates about whether it's okay just to let the man speak because that's their culture, or whether we should ask the woman to speak. It can be doubly difficult if the woman in their culture does the catering, and so you have a kind of double whammy that doesn't fit with my model. I tend to go with what's comfortable for them. So I used to be much more, you've all got to take part in the way I've been trained, how this should happen. And now I'm more like, you need to take part in the way that's comfortable for you. So I've slightly got off my high horse around that. And I trained mediators in Bangladesh a few years ago, and the challenge there was with in the legal profession, which is very hierarchical, and we wanted to say that being a mediator is not the same as being a judge or a barrister or a lawyer. You know, it's a different set of skills, but there was an expectation that the more senior people would graduate better on the mediation course than because of their rank rather than their ability. So that was a kind of challenge to explain how we'd made some decisions for people.
That's a very interesting thought and observation, Carey, and thank you for asking that, Helen, because I've dealt with this actually this past semester here at Northern Virginia Community College. We have about 185 different nationalities and cultures represented. For the first time this past semester, I had a student, a female student, who was covered. Okay, and it was a challenge for me, not just trying to know, well, how do I communicate respectfully? You know, the whole thing with the eye contact and all of that. And I was struggling a little bit, not because I didn't want to communicate, but I wanted to know how to do it respectfully. And so I ended up just asking, and it created a good dialogue. But I can certainly see those cross-cultural differences in a mediation sequence.
Yeah. So I just, Phil, I was just writing down the word when you're talking, I wrote, just ask is what I wrote down on my paper, isn't it? But there's something in us that stops us. Sometimes just saying, you know, what's the best way to do this? How would this work for you? And we go into I don't know what, panic mode, or I don't want to make a mistake. And then we're much more likely to make a mistake because we're not asking what would work for you. I had called her over at the end of class, and being from a Middle Eastern culture myself, I understood the whole male-female eye contact thing. And I just asked her, I said, I understand about the cultural differences in eye contact and
talking, a male talking to a female. And I just want to be able to be respectful and communicate this correctly. And she sort of just laughed. And she said, oh, no, it's not a problem. That's why I'm here. My parents believe that I'm, you know, I want to continue this education. It's my choice to be covered, but it doesn't stop me from communicating or
don't need to talk,
talking with others. But I did notice that I could always, I was more cognizant of her attentiveness in eye contact and her nonverbals even being covered.
Mm-hmm. Something else that Helen, in the UK with our community mediation programs, we tend to draw the mediators from the local community, and so we're quite a varied group in particularly my community mediation scheme. But then we have got people we can draw on and ask them about a kind of is this a cultural difference? Is there something we should be thinking about? Should we think about the mediator team? What preparation we can do? And that can be really helpful. And that would be over and above. We may need translators as well, because English may not be the first language. And obviously the downside of mediation is you need to be able to speak and to listen in the same language for it to work. You know, we haven't cracked that one as yet.
Who's got another question or comment?
I'm just reflecting on a life experience. We had a client in Vienna that was a huge multinational organization, and what a disaster. As a result of Helen's question and your comments, Carey, in the room were both power levels, and the whole organization was almost a caste system, and we were there to train a mediation model that took for granted that these distinctions didn't exist.
Yes.
And it was probably my worst professional experience of my life. The people at the top of the hierarchy were so attitudinal, even, you know, right there in public. It was intimidating. It was. And so this is a big issue. I think when you try to move mediation across cultures, you have to be extremely careful of what the cultural piece is. And it doesn't mean going from one geographical spot to another with the current world we're living in and the multiple cultures that we're surrounded by. It means being very cognizant of any mediation you're running, so as Philip said, in his very school situation. Yeah.
Yes. I think the joy of being in a session like this is that we're all committed to listening and we're interested in it, and we slightly take it for granted, and then you have that shock, don't you, where you go somewhere where the whole rules are completely different and it's like, whoa. And I think we have to remind ourselves that not everybody is operating in this space that we're operating in, and so we're lucky we have these communities in which to speak and be heard, and other people don't, because they're locked in systems that are scary, really, aren't they? I think.
Carey, I'm not a mediator, as you know, but what do you do in a cross-cultural situation like that, where you have, I think as you indicated, you've got rules that you assume don't exist in mediation, but they exist in that situation? Do you acknowledge them? I wouldn't assume that you ignore them. Do you allow them to be?
I haven't done very much kind of corporate mediation, so my interest is very much about how people talk to each other, much more the kind of one-on-one. What I've been doing more of, the more I've mediated, is say I've got people in the room and their styles are different. I point it out to them, but I might say, so so I had one case where I had a manager who didn't like his staff member being late, and I said, so you're the manager and you don't like your staff member to be late, but you think it's all right for you to be late, you know. And I had the staff member and said, so your manager doesn't like you to be late, and your manager believes they can behave differently from you, you know. So all you can kind of do is say, this is where we're at, and what does anybody want to do about it, really? I was quite shocked, though, to find a manager who didn't believe in the need to role model the behavior they wanted from their staff. So I may have had a little bit of unconscious bias coming out, possibly in my tone. But all we can sort of do is say, this is what I'm seeing. When you communicate, my observation is you look out the window. Is that what's happening? Do you want to kind of you know, that sort of thing. So literally feeding back what I can see or hear in front of me. Mm-hmm. Because it is really their situation to sort out. So that's one of the joys of mediation, is to keep handing it back to the people.
Very different from mediation, as Ellen had pointed out, or
yeah.
Excuse me, arbitration.
Yes.
Yeah. Other people that we haven't heard from? Anyone else have a question or a comment for Carey?
I think that's
Or Carey, would you like to throw out a question for anyone? Because it looks like we do have a handful of mediators still on.
Yes, I guess my question would be, does anybody else have any ideas about how they can use any of the things I talked about, or how they're using some of the ideas I talked about? Because I didn't invent everything I was talking about, but how they might use things in everyday life or in their work.
I don't like to be the person speaking all the time. Believe me, I am a listener. But I'll make this observation. Your visuals, your graphics for your PowerPoint, I thought were outstanding. And I think it would probably have some value to try to use visuals in a mediation.
Yeah, great idea.
I don't know that I've ever gone that approach, but I must say they helped a great deal to get the concept that you were sharing across.
Okay.
So that's my observation.
So I'm going to say thanks to Laura for hounding me to get the visuals in there, because I'm so word-based. We had a little tussle, didn't we, Laura, about words or pictures, but I really hear that feedback from Carol, so that's fantastic. There is a new field that other people may be aware of called graphic facilitation, but I'm just starting to find out about it, but it's the idea of using more pictures, so using a flip chart and trying to draw pictures rather than record words. That I think is really interesting, because there are people for whom pictures work better than that. So that's one of the areas that I'm going to be exploring this year. It's on my list, but it's called graphic facilitation, I think. And I think generally most things start over on your side of the pond, and then we bring them over and make them our own. So I think most of the groundwork's been done in the States, as far as I know.
Well, what I can say, Carey, if it wasn't for your country, we wouldn't be here. So I'm not sure we're always the one at the front edge there. But is graphic facilitation something that's used in mediation? Is that a form of mediation?
No, it is I think it's being used by some people, and in one of the groups I mediate, we had a presentation the other day, and I was thinking that could be great. That could be powerful. Partly, I mean, some people may already use a flip chart or a board in mediation. If you have a flip chart, you get people to focus on the board and not on each other, which can be a useful tool for diffusing. Particularly Anita earlier was talking about angry people. You know, if you don't want them to look at each other, you can get them to look at the board. But I think, just maybe using pictures to chart things out just might it's sort of like trying to free people up to think of other ways to solve things. So I think it's really interesting.
That's very interesting. I've never heard that term, graphic facilitation, but I know I've used this in classes, particularly when we're talking about listening itself. And I have a big whiteboard, and I ask students to come up. Okay, so come up here, and I give them the marker, and I said, draw what listening looks like to you. And it's really amazing. You get so many different things, not just the stick figures that I draw, but the great graphics and cartoons and everything. So yeah, the power of the visual we can't underestimate.
But also there's the power of but there's getting people to do things in a different way and access a different part of their brain and maybe have fun with something that frees them to be more creative. So I think that's great. I'm going to use that idea. Thank you.
Yeah, Phil, I like that you brought that up, and some of the people on the call might, this name is familiar, Kai Degner, Kaidegner. He's an ILA member, and he has a series out on YouTube right now, and I particularly like his first introduction to listening because it's called Listening is Boring. And he talks about how the process of listening is boring and who really wants to know something like that. But it's what we get through listening that's really exciting. So we have to go through that process to get to the end goal, whether it be a better relationship, a raise on the job, or things like that. So listening is boring.
That's great, isn't it?
I like it.
Well, it makes you stop and think. It makes me stop and think, isn't it? It's like, oh, okay, fantastic.
And I see we are just about running out of time. Are there any last comments, last words from anyone?
I was interested in what you were saying about graphic representation. I've been looking at statistics about social media recently, and I've been interested that the statistics seem to show that if you have a picture up on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, you get far more attention than if you just have words. Fairly self-evident, I suppose, but it links very much in with what you were just saying, like something of the way society works nowadays, and maybe we do relate more to pictures than we do words, or maybe we need both.
Yeah, well, I'd always been an advocate for both because I'm very word-based. But yeah, I suspect there is a shift, isn't there? Yes. Interesting, though. Really interesting.
I believe the Generation Z that's coming up is much more graphic-based than they are text-based because they've been raised with social media.
Yes.
Yeah. Terrific.
Well, you think about Laura, I was just going to add in all the graphic novels that have come about in recent times. That's another indication that pictures are starting to be very important to people.
Yes, yes,
absolutely.
Indeed.
Well, some of that I suspect goes back to the whole idea that our long-term memory is episodic. So we think in stories, and pictures help us remember stories more so than oftentimes text does. But again, that's a whole nother webinar too. So on behalf of the International Listening Association, I really want to thank Carey Haslam for a great webinar today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
I hear and I see lots of people clapping. So thank you, Carey. We look forward to following you. And again, we will send out the PowerPoint presentation to everyone today.
Fantastic.
And if you would like to contact Carey, you'll find that her email is on there. So she welcomes feedback from you as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I've really enjoyed it. So thanks.
Thanks, Carey. And Phil, do you want to take it away and help people understand better how to leave the meeting again?
Why, certainly. Thank you again, Carey, for a very interesting, informative, and fun webinar. I know that I've learned a great deal. We were talking yesterday about concepts, and I actually translate the concepts while you're talking about them. And thank you to everybody for joining us and for your questions and your comments. We hope you join us for future webinars. To leave the webinar, the only thing that you have to do is click on the toolbar that says Leave Meeting.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carol.
Okay.
Thanks, Carey.
That's a pleasure. See ya.
We're down to 9.
We will have this. It's recorded, and I will be downloading this and uploading, and we'll be posting this on YouTube shortly.
Okay. Okay.
Perfect. Phil, you might want to stop the recording now.
Okay.